Well, last week, we've been starting this series and continuing this series on the life of Joseph. And as we concluded the message last week, we saw that Joseph, after being sold as a slave by his brothers, had this, short period or maybe a little bit longer period of success where he rose to be in charge of everything in Potiphar's household. And then we watched things go from good to bad, or as the title of the message was, from riches to rags in an instant. Joseph was thrown into prison where he was being punished for a crime that he did not commit. He was there, if you remember, because Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of trying to rape her. And without so much as a hint of a fair trial, he was thrown into prison, and he remains there for who knows how long at this point in the story. And so, as we have studied so far, we know that God was using Joseph. He was training him. He was going to provide, for him and his family in a very important and significant way, and really, ultimately, beyond that for the Israelites as a whole. And he began to give Joseph these dreams early on in his life, forewarning him, telling him of what was to come. And they were prophetic messages from God, but now he was in prison, and why was he here? What could possibly be the benefit of this? And how do you get where you're going from here, when you need to go on with your life? And yes, we see even while he's in prison that the warden puts other prisoners under his care, and he continues to exercise this administrative gift that he has and these abilities. But, it's not exactly something that reads well on the resume. You know what I mean? Can you see it? Like, I was just thinking, what would a cover letter go like? Dear Pharaoh, I'm writing to let you know that I would like to be in charge of all of Egypt. Well, second in charge, behind you, of course. I'm a foreigner. I was, brought here into Egypt against my will. I was sold as a slave by my brothers. They didn't like me very much. They stole my coat, by the way. Can you do anything about that? It was an expensive coat, one of those big fancy kinds with all the colors and somewhat like yours, maybe, to think of it. Well, anyway, I was eventually sold to Potiphar, where I rose to be quite, in a position of authority in his house. And then I was thrown into prison because his wife said I tried to rape her. But I didn't do it. I'm innocent. I am. Right, Joseph. Yeah, that's what they all say. And by the way, I now realize I'm down 2 coats. Potiphar's wife has my other one. And that's another thing. It's cold in here. Can you do anything about the heat in this place? I think the furnace must be broken. So now that I'm in prison, I've been placed in charge of the other prisoners, and well, I'd like to get out of here and run the country. Rest assured, whatever you need, I'm your man. What do you think? Please see the attached resume where my complete job history is included and the other qualifications are clearly stated. I look forward to hearing from you at your earliest convenience. Yours truly, Joseph, inmate, palace of the captain of the guard prison. And then he writes, P.S., I'm just making this up, of course. I was going to put down Potiphar as a reference, but maybe that's not the best right now. His wife is still pretty peeved at me. So maybe you can talk to the prison warden here, and I think he'll vouch for me. This just doesn't seem like all that great of a plan. This detour in his life, how's going to be, this being in charge of a few prisoners going to save his family? Looking at the situation at that moment, it would be nearly impossible to see or to predict how God was going to use this situation, how things were going to come together for good in Joseph's life from where he was. And regardless of what abilities he might have had or developed along the way, his administrative things, it just doesn't seem like a path to success. I doubt many prospective employers would have any clue what Joseph was capable of, or even that he was even there. And he's a prisoner behind bars. Who wants to hire a prisoner? How would he get out? It's not as if the charges have been dropped. It seems like a dead end, if there ever was a dead end. I was thinking, this is kind of silly, but I watch movies sometimes over and over that I like, and one of them is the movie Hoosiers. I don't know how many of you have ever seen that. If you're from Indiana, this is like required watching. You got to watch this movie. But if you're not, maybe some of you have seen it. It's loosely based on a true story about a basketball team from this tiny rural school in Indiana that eventually goes on to win the state championship against all the big schools. And during that movie, there's one particular boy, his character name is Jimmy Chitwood in the movie, and he's a very talented basketball player, but he's not currently playing on the team. And his older sister, who was also a teacher in the school, his father's passed on, but his older sister's kind of watching out for him, and she wants something different. She wants him to go to college and get an education, get out of this place, and she wants, something different for his life. And the coach is talking to her, and he says, if he's as good as everybody says he is, wouldn't a college basketball scholarship make a lot of sense? And she responds by saying, who would ever see him play? No one ever even comes into Hickory except for the train, and it's here for about 5 minutes. And that seems to be sort of the situation with Joseph. No matter how great of a job he's doing down in the prison, who cares? Who knows? Whatever his qualities are, no one from the outside even knows he's there or cares. He's basically gone and forgotten by his family, by his former employees, by anybody and everybody else. So we're going to pick up the story today from about at this point when he's in prison. This is in chapter 40 of Genesis, and this is what it says. Chapter 40, starting in verse 1. Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. They remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. So in this passage so far, we see that two others are joining Joseph in this prison. He's got some visitors, whether he wanted them or not. They are the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of Pharaoh. They did something to offend him. I don't know. We don't know what it was. I guess, what did he do? Forget to put the sugar in the tea or something? Or he burnt the cupcakes and tried to cover it over with that cheap store-bought icing. It just didn't go well, whatever it was. It landed them both in prison for a long time, or quite a time, it says. And it's only through, as we look back at the story, it's only through this perspective of hindsight in the story that we can even begin to get an inkling of what God might be doing in this situation. Joseph had proven himself to be a capable administrator in Potiphar's house, and now he's exercising some of those same abilities in prison. But lying dormant in Joseph's life is really perhaps his most significant gift, his most glorified one. This idea of dreams and interpreting dreams as a way for God to communicate through him what is going to happen. And it's just been sitting there. Nothing's been happening. And I just thought, pause for a minute. Have you ever been there in your life where you're doing something that you don't even want to be doing necessarily, and you feel like the things that you do best, the greatest gifts you have, are not even being used at all, and you're just kind of existing, I think it's got to be a lot the way it is. And when this happens, it can be really, really discouraging in your life. Let's keep reading, though. This is in verse 5, continuing. It says, while they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they both looked upset. Why do you look so worried today? He asked them. And they replied, we both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean. Interpreting dreams is God's business, Joseph replied. Go ahead and tell me your dreams. Now, I don't want you to miss the significance of that last sentence. Interpreting dreams is God's business, Joseph said. Go ahead and tell me your dreams. See, this ability to interpret dreams is beyond human ability. It's not a matter of knowledge. Joseph clearly understood that it was God working through him that was giving him the ability to interpret these dreams. It was just not some talent or skill that he had developed along the way. It was a true gift of God. And without God in the process, it would have been totally worthless. Because who really knows the future but God? And we don't do all that well as humans of predicting the future. You just have to look at a weather forecast lately. I always remember this moment. A couple years ago, my brother Stanton, who a lot of you have met over the years, from Germany, was here visiting, and we, as we always do when we get together, we try to go play a couple rounds of golf, and we had played a couple places, but we had saved this last day before he had to go back to play a nice course at Paco Ridge, and we had arranged this tee time right when the afternoon rate started so that we could get a good price for it. And we looked at the weather forecast on our app and on the weather, and it showed 0% chance of rain, right? 0%. So when we arrived and we warmed up, and it was a little bit cloudy, but it was fine. And then when we got over to the first tee, it was our time to go. It was just sprinkling, just a few drops here and there. We're going to go out and play and do our thing, and we're going to have a good time because this is our last day together and all that stuff. Well, I want to tell you, by the time we got to the fourth tee, the rain was absolutely pouring down. The wind was blowing. It was an absolute mess. And we finally got up towards the green, and we found our balls on the green. You couldn't even putt them. It was like a lake on the green. I mean, you try to hit the ball, it wouldn't even go more than a couple feet, no matter how hard you hit it. It would just, it was just like putting in a lake. And we thought, this is crazy. And I remember there was a restroom facility just up the hill from there. And so we went there and we kind of hung out. There was an overhang, and we hung out and tried to get a little bit of shelter, and the rain just kept pouring and coming down. Well, when Mexico rains, it usually lasts 10 or 15 minutes, and it'll be gone. So we sat there, and we're getting wetter and wetter, blowing in and carrying on. An hour. We sat there under this little porch about 3 feet for an hour, still pouring down rain, not the smidge of a chance of it letting up. And I'm looking at my weather app. 0% chance of rain. 0! Not 5, not 10. 0. It was like, how does this happen? How does this happen? And who gets to keep their job after that? This is not even close. But that's the way it is sometimes. And it's easy. It's easy to pick on the weathermen. But I want to talk about something a little more important. It's one thing to try to pick the weather. It's not very predictable. It's something that, even with the best of technology and all that, we don't do it very well. But of a more concerning nature are sometimes these religious figures in our societies and in the world, and leaders of cults and self-proclaimed prophets. They go out on a limb sometimes, and they begin to predict the future. And I tell you, they're on very risky ground when they do so. And I would say right away, if you hear somebody doing that, going in that direction, to proceed with great caution. Because there are a lot of problems. There's a lot of nuts out there. A lot of people who, for example, have predicted the end of the world, right? The world's going to end on, whatever. Some people thought it was going to end at the turn of the millennium, right? In 2000, January, year 2000. Or other people, they have predicted times over the years, or when Jesus was going to come back, some of them would predict that, and all kinds of things. The scriptures clearly tell us that no man knows the day or the hour. This just a little verse from Mark 13:32 says, however, no one knows the day or the hour when these things will happen. When we're talking about Jesus coming back. Not even the angels in heaven or the Son himself. Only the Father knows. Religious history is sort of littered with these kinds of proclamations, and they often turn out to be completely false. And then afterwards, there's always some little lie that goes with that one, and another modification of the prophecy, and trying to salvage what little credibility may still exist from their followers. But you see, if it's truly a prophecy of God, it won't be false. You can rest assured of that. And if it turns out to be false, then that person is nothing but a false prophet, and we need to recognize it as such. And we're gullible. We're far too gullible. In Deuteronomy 18:20 and 22, this is what it says. But any prophet who falsely acclaims to speak in my name, or who speaks in the name of another god, must die. There you go. But you may wonder, how will we know whether or not a prophecy is from the Lord? If the prophet speaks in the Lord's name, but his prediction does not happen or come true, you will know that the Lord did not give that message. That prophet has spoken without my authority and need not be feared. In other words, the quickest way to identify a false prophet is when his predictions don't come through. These are predictions that are clearly not of God. Well, here in this case, with Joseph, his predictions do come true. And he gives us the reason. Why? Because they are of God. He tells us right from the start. So let's read through the dreams. This is starting in verse 9. A couple dreams here. He says, so the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream first. In my dream, he said, I saw a grapevine in front of me. The vine had 3 branches that began to bud and blossom, and soon it produced clusters of ripe grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's wine cup in my hand, so I took a cluster of grapes and squeezed the juice into the cup. Then I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. This is what the dream means, Joseph said. The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as his chief cupbearer. And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it. So here's the other dream. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given the first dream such a positive interpretation, he said to Joseph, I had a dream too. In my dream, there were 3 baskets of white pastries stacked on my head. The top basket contained all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them from the basket on my head. This is what the dream means, Joseph told him. The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift you up and impale your body on a pole. Then birds will come and peck away your flesh. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, and he prepared a banquet for all the officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position, so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dreams. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. And the lesson for this story is don't burn the cupcakes. No, that's not really it. But it's hard to imagine what it is that a chief baker could do that would not only land him in jail but require his life in punishment. We don't really know what it was. But we know that Joseph interpreted this dream correctly. He was not a false prophet, and he proved it. And there he sat in prison. He did it right. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. He spoke from the Lord, and there he sat. His slim chance of getting out hinged on the good graces of this chief cupbearer who once was in prison himself, but he was now restored to his former position, and he forgot all about Joseph. Now was not Joseph's time. He was more than ready to get out of this prison, I'm sure, but there he remained. And the next verses tell us exactly how long. In the next chapter, Genesis 41, it says, 2 full years later, Joseph dreamed. No, Pharaoh dreamed, not Joseph. Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dreams, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and began grazing in the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up. But then he fell asleep again and had a second dream. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. The next morning, Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dream, so he called all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told him his dreams, not one of them could tell him what they meant. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today I have been reminded of my failure, he told Pharaoh. Some time ago, you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night, the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant. And everything happened just as he had predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. Now, it took 2 full years after Joseph had correctly interpreted the baker and the cupbearer's dreams to get another opportunity. All the time, he was sitting there in prison, the prime of his life, wasting away. His gifts remaining largely unused, waiting for something to happen, and more than likely not going to happen. It'd be hard to even imagine with each passing day that anything positive was ever going to happen or he would ever get out of there. Going on in verse 14, it says, Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. It is beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. So Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. In my dream, he said, I was standing on the bank of the Nile River, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come out of the river, and it began grazing in the marsh grass. But then I saw 7 sick-looking cows, scrawny and thin, come up after them. I've never seen such sorry-looking animals in all the land of Egypt. These thin, scrawny cows ate the 7 fat cows, but afterwards you wouldn't have known it, for they were still thin and scrawny as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and beautiful, growing in a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were blighted, shriveled, and withered by the east wind. And the shriveled heads swallowed the 7 healthy heads. I told these dreams to the magicians, but no one could tell me what they mean. Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows and 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows came up later, and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterward, there will be 7 years of famine, so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will also be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will soon make them happen. You notice in verse 16 that, and we read it, that Joseph told Pharaoh basically the same thing he had told the cupbearer and the baker. This business of interpreting dreams, it's God's business. This is God that can do this. And by saying, Joseph was taking no credit for his ability to do this. He was just simply a messenger. And he said this up front so that Pharaoh would know that what he was saying was coming from the Lord. And it was decreed by God. It was going to happen, whether he wanted it to or not, whether he liked it or not. But by giving him this information, he couldn't prevent it, but he could prepare for it. And so this is where we're going to stop today. And I want to just kind of reflect on the story just a little bit, a few lessons that we might learn from here. One of the things that's clear is God is many times working in our lives, even when the situation looks absolutely hopeless, like a complete dead end. In fact, the way that God was working in Joseph's life was probably the only way he was ever going to get out of that prison cell. He wasn't going to see daylight ever again unless something happened pretty significant. And when we find ourselves in that sort of situation, it may look like a complete disaster to us, but that may be the very place that God is at work. Another lesson is that God does not often tell us what he's doing. We can see from hindsight that God was preparing Joseph. Joseph didn't know that. He didn't know what was going on. He doesn't know why. We are in training, but we don't often recognize it as such. It's difficult for us to accept it. It's difficult for us to understand it. But we have to allow God to work and trusting him for both the process and the end result. The third lesson that seems so clear to me is that these things often take time, a lot of time, much more time than we ever thought. It's not because God's unable to do this quickly or any faster, but the timing is not right. God is always on time. He's never late. He's never early. He's always on time. And Joseph remained in prison for years, waiting. Waiting for what? For this moment when Pharaoh is going to have these dreams that no doubt the Lord put in Pharaoh's head. but he had no assurance that it would even ever come. And the fourth lesson perhaps is clearly understanding that our spiritual gifts are from God, and they are to be used by God and not selfishly, always for his purposes, always for his glory. And when God chooses to use these gifts, it's always out of our control. God is in charge here about that whole thing. We're going to sing a song as we close the service today, and in it there's a line I want you to remember. It talks about the idea of God being the potter and us the clay. Sometimes we think we're doing this all on our own. This is, we're just mustering up the courage and the skill to do life on our own. But this song reminds us that God is truly the potter, and we are the clay, and we are at his service, and we place ourselves in his hands and just allow him to work in our lives. So I encourage you, if you want to go ahead and stand, but you want to come and pray, you're always welcome to do that. But let's sing this last song with that understanding of what God is in charge of our lives. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Search me and try me, Master, today. Whiter than snow, Lord, wash me just now, as in thy presence humbly I bow. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Wounded and weary, help me, I pray. Power, all power, surely is thine. Touch me and heal me, Savior divine. Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Hold o'er my being, absolute sway. Fill with thy spirit, till all shall see Christ only, always living in me. Well, thank you all for being here, and encourage you to have a wonderful week and celebrate the Lord's presence in your life. Let's bow together. Lord, we ask that you walk with us out of this place and in through the week ahead in our lives of work or tasks and dues and things that we have to do, or traveling. We ask that you would be with us and allow us to know your presence. Continue to speak to us. Help us to trust you, Lord, even when we're not sure where it is all leading. Go with us in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you.